So good afternoon, everyone. All right, try it one more time. Good afternoon. All right, very good. So like KT said, my name is Andre Costantini, and I'm a professional photographer and even make movies from time to time. But today, we're going to go over the 11 Simple Secrets to Better Pictures seminar. And so you'll get at least 11 and, maybe 12. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. The first thing that I wanted to discuss is this idea of creating images with impact. And I think no matter what type of pictures that you like to take and wherever your photography leads, it's always your goal to do this, whether or not you're conscious or not if that's what your goal is, because you want to take a picture and then show it to someone and they go, wow, yeah, that's pretty good, because then you know that you've done your job effectively. Now, obviously, it's important for all of you to be able to make pictures that you're proud of, but there's always something nice about you can make and say, well, that's exactly what I wanted, and then the rest of the world also starts to take a look at that and agrees with you. That's good. So there's something nice about that. And so it's our goal to be able to understand how to create these images with impact. So the first thing I want to discuss is what exactly is the criteria for that. So what does that mean? Okay, we can sort of collectively agree that we all want to make pictures that have impact, that we like, that we're proud of, and that other people also resonate with. But what does that mean? So it can mean different things, because photography isn't strictly technical, it isn't strictly art, it isn't strictly lighting, it's not just being creative or style or composition, but it's the combination of all these things working together. Sometimes some are more important than others that come together to be able to create this type of image. First thing I want to do is just show you a couple of images. Now, all of these images that I'm showing you now were all made by photographers, presumably just like you, because these came in for a photo contest that Tamron ran a couple of years ago called Make Your Mark. And so one could interpret that any way that they want, and people submitted all these types of great images. Now, you might look at some of these pictures and say, well, I could do a better job than that, or I have a better picture than that. Or you might look at it and say, wow, I wish I could take a picture like that. And it really depends where in your skill level and in your career with photography you are. Now, of course, there's nothing more frustrating than not being able to get the image you want. So when you know that you have this great lens and this great camera and it has all of the capabilities to do exactly what you want, and yet you're not able to make it quite work. So what I'm going to do today is go over all of these different styles and ways of looking at some of the technical sides of photography, and then some of the artistic and lighting sides of photography. And hopefully, depending on where your skill level is, then you'll be able to resonate and walk out of here better photographers, because that ultimately is my goal, is to empower you with the knowledge to make the pictures that you want to make. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is something very technical. By a show of hands, how many people use the auto or green box mode of their camera? Okay, you could admit it. There's nothing wrong. There's no judgment here, at least by me, maybe by your peers. But okay, P or program mode? Maybe? No? Aperture priority mode? Shutter priority mode? And manual mode. Okay, very good, very good. All of these different modes are created to do different things. Now, there's nothing wrong with the green box auto mode if it's going to give you the results that you want. However, often, because it's making all of the decisions for you, it doesn't know what you're thinking, and despite the fact it's designed to help you, in some cases, it may not. So for example, if you're using the auto mode of your camera or the green box mode, and we were to try to take a picture in here right now, and I were to take a picture of this gentleman here, I'm sure the first thing that would happen is the flash would pop up. Now, if I didn't want the flash to pop up, I'd put it down, I'd try to take a picture again, and the flash would pop up. Because in the auto mode, the camera doesn't think there's enough light for you to be able to successfully handhold and take a picture. And the camera may be correct, but first of all, if I'm on a tripod, the camera wouldn't know that, and it doesn't know what my vision is. It just knows what it's been programmed to do. So if you're one of those people that uses the green box auto mode almost exclusively. If you move down just to that P or program mode, now the default is still going to be very similar to auto, except that flash isn't automatically going to pop up. And in addition to that, you'll be able to start to make some decisions. So if you want to add the flash, then you push the button, put it, and it will pop up. If you want to change your aperture, you can change that, and then the corresponding shutter speed will match it as well. So it gives you some more control. If you then move to the aperture priority mode, what happens is you're picking the aperture, and the camera is picking the shutter speed to give you what it thinks is the correct exposure. And most of the time it's right. In the shutter priority, or time value if you're a Canon shooter, what's happening is your camera is allowing you to pick the shutter speed, and it's picking a corresponding aperture. Now, the problem with the shutter priority mode is that if you say, I would like to shoot this at an 8,000th of a second, and there's not enough light, it'll still shoot at an 8,000th of a second, but you're going to have an underexposed or probably pretty dark picture. So if you understand the relationship between the shutter and the aperture, which is, if this is a fixed amount of light, as you change one, the other needs to change as well to keep that amount of light fixed. And so the goal is to really be able to understand that if you use aperture priority mode, at the widest aperture that you have, you're always going to get the fastest possible shutter speed that there is. So for example, if you were using this 70 to 200 2.8 lens and you had it wide open at 2.8, then the fastest shutter speed that you can get is going to be at 2.8 because the most light is coming in, and so consequently that will be the fastest shutter. And then of course there's the manual mode where it allows you to control both of those things. Now keep in mind that when you're looking at in your camera, and even if you have it in the manual mode, the camera's meter is always working. So it'll tell you what it thinks, and it could be right or it could be wrong. But if you are apprehensive to use manual mode because you feel like you don't know enough, keep in mind that the camera is still always telling you what it thinks. So you can use that as a guideline if to give you a little bit more control. All right. Next, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about a couple of different concepts. One of them has the idea of looking. And then if you walk into this room, the first thing you do is maybe look around, and then maybe something catches your eye, and then you start to see something, and you really start to focus. And seeing is sort of a deeper concept than looking, because look is just an awareness of the scene, but when you start to see something, then there's some element that you take interest in. And then, as a photographer, you try to create something. So if you walk into a room and you see something and it catches your attention, and you look a little bit further and you have your camera and you want to photograph it, then you try to find a way to represent whatever it is you're photographing in some way. And it may be a function of how you create the composition, or it may be a function of the lighting, or all these other things. But your goal is then to try to recreate or create something very specific. Now, the question is, how do we reconstruct all those elements? And how do we take the image of something that we want so it has that power and it has that impact that we're looking for? Now, one of the things to consider is that what you include in the frame is extremely important, because if you include something, it should be of some value, visually, in terms of being able to convey information. So if you isolate something, then you're not showing things. So everything that's in the frame is extremely important. Then there's always the relationship between the backgrounds and the foregrounds of your image. Sometimes light and dark relationships, dealing with contrast and points of where your eye will be directed to. There's color, and there's also different compositional elements. So we're going to start with this. This is actually not one of the 11 secrets. This is a sidebar creative secret, which is creative images impact a viewer's imagination. So it goes something deeper than what it is. I think great examples of that, I'll start with photojournalism. If an image is really impactful, it's usually not just because it's illustrating whatever the story is, but because there's something deeper that speaks to us as human beings. So it's more about the condition and not specifically the event. And that's how certain images become iconic and last over time. So if we think about it this way, If an image is a visual representation, then if we see something with the imagination, then we're looking at it in our mind. And I think a lot of times having images that have that power affect our minds and our imagination in some way. So we're going to look at this image really quickly, and I need to ask all of you what you think of it. Anything? Nothing. Okay. All right, very good. Does it make them feel anything? Pretty much apathy and indifference. Is that what I'm getting? Okay, great. What about this image? I heard a little oohs and ahs, so apparently there's some difference between this one and the last image, right? And what makes one image have more merit than another image? Is it the composition? Is it the subject? Is it the lighting? Is it a combination of all these things, right, that come together? So the difference between a good photograph, the first photograph was properly exposed. It was composed, I guess, okay, and it was presented all right. So technically, maybe there wasn't anything wrong with the photograph. It's just that most of you simply didn't care because it didn't grab you in any way. But great photographs have those other elements. So they have impact in usually feeling, and it's done by understanding how your camera works and bringing your own sort of vision into the mix. So let's see. We're going to look first at this one. So the first secret that we're gonna talk about has to do, ironically enough, with lens choice, because secret one is experiment with your lens. Now here's an image, right, that was taken with 18 millimeters. 18 millimeters considered usually a wider angle focal length. Now, interestingly enough, if I were to walk up to any one of you, I'm just going to use this gentleman as an example because he's closest to me, and if I did this, right now you can't focus on my hands and you can't focus on my face. And the other thing is that that my hands physically look larger because that's the way that the eye works. So now one would think normally that if you wanted things to look normal, you would use a 50 millimeter or normal focal length lens. But in this case, using an 18 millimeter and getting close to your subject visually represents the way that we see much truer. So one might not think that, but in the case, that's the way that it works. So you can try this at home if you'd like to walk up to people like this. What am I doing? What am I doing? All right, so number one is experiment with your lens. And when I say that, it's taking whatever lenses that you have and it's working the angle. There's a difference between getting close with a wide angle lens and standing back with a telephoto lens, partially because of the optical characteristics of telephoto versus wide angle. But all of these different points of view have an impact on how the image gets constructed. So get in close, move far back, change the subject of the composition, provide certain contexts or environments, and then select the depth of field to best suit the subject. So if we go back just for 1 second here, you'll also notice that she's in focus and her hands are out of focus, correct? Now I could have changed the aperture to increase the depth of field to try to get everything in focus, but that actually isn't the way that we see. So it looks much more natural to have certain things in focus and other things out of focus. Now just to sort of go through a range here of focal lengths and discuss that aspect. So here is a little series of photographs. The first one taken at 18 millimeters, and then what I did is I slowly zoomed in 35 millimeters, 75, 150, 200, and then finally 270. So having a lens, in this case the 18 to 270, which has a 15 times optical zoom, and for anyone that really cares, when somebody talks about the power of a zoom, it's basically simple math. You take the wide angle number and you divide it into the telephoto number, and whatever number that is how powerful the zoom is. So now you know. All these years, I'm sure you've wanted to know that, and now you do. So 18 goes into 270 15 times, so this is a 15 times optical zoom. And you have this entire range. So this image obviously has a different impact and feel and context than that image. So everything you choose to include. Or if you wanted to take that 270 and focus anywhere else in the scene, think about the hundreds of pictures that are possibilities, and you're making the decision when you click the shutter what's in the frame and how you frame it up. But having the ability to go through this whole range with one lens gives you more options. So this being super wide angle lens, right? And this being super telephoto. So here, 11 millimeters to 500 millimeters, having a different impact and shooting different things. And then, of course, there's also macro. Now, with macro, you're really, in general, close to your subject. And with true macro lenses, like a 60 millimeter or a 90 or 180 millimeter lens, you can get actual one-to-one macro magnification, which is pretty cool. So take advantage of this macro ability too. So the proximity you are to your subject and the focal length you're using. Now I want to talk briefly about a couple of functions that lens technology can enhance. One of them has to do with the angle of view of the actual lens. So for example, having something that goes from 18 millimeters to 270 millimeters, a 15 times zoom in one convenient little package, something about this size or so. And so having that ability with one lens means A, you don't have to change lenses, and B, you can carry around something convenient and light. And maybe you're the type of person that likes to take all of your gear with you all the time, or if you're like me, I prefer that someone else carries it and I just could use what I want. Anyway, so then you're also dealing with the minimum focusing distance of a lens. And the minimum focusing distance of a lens controls how much magnification that it ultimately has. So for example, many lenses like this lens right here, which is the 18 to 270, has a macro feature. So if any of you have zoom lenses that say macro on them, it means that in general it's going to be at the most telephoto focal length, so in this case 270 millimeters, and you're going to be at whatever the minimum focusing distance of the lens. In this case it's about 1.5 feet. So once you're at that distance, that's going to give you the most macro capability that your lens has. Now by photo industry standards, any lens that gives you 1:4 magnification or quarter life size or greater can be called a macro lens. And true macro lenses give you 1:1 magnification. Another technology example is VC. That's Tamron Stabilization, which is in almost all of their lenses at this point. And what stabilization does in any lens allows you to hand hold an image at a slower shutter speed than used to be possible. And basically what it does is it detects movement, and in detecting the movement, it counteracts whatever your action is as the photographer and allows you to be able to get clearer pictures. Now, what the stabilizer doesn't do is if you have low light and a moving subject, it doesn't freeze action any better. And if you have it on a tripod, it can actually create blur. So it's recommended by every manufacturer currently that you would turn that switch off, which is why they give you an option to turn it off. So long exposures on a tripod, shut it off. Other than that, you can pretty much leave it on all the time. If you have faster shutter speeds, it simply won't impact it, but it's that marginal somewhere between a second and an eighth of a second in that range where hand holding it with this is really valuable. An example of that. So here I am in Times Square, on the edge of the street, not really able to put a tripod down. Also, the traffic's moving, everything is kind of crazy. It's Times Square. You've all been there, right? Or at least seen it, heard of it, maybe? Okay. Anyway, this was with the 28 to 300 millimeter lens at 42 millimeters, and it was handheld at 1/6 of a second. Now, the traditional rule is that you take one and you put it over the focal length that you're using. That's the slowest shutter speed that you want to use. So for example, if you have a lens that's 28 to 300 millimeters, at 28 millimeters, you want to be at about 1/30th of a second. Any slower than that, the chances of you moving while the picture is being taken and creating blur, it starts to get pretty high. But as you zoom your lens to say 300 millimeters, now you have to be at about 1/300th of a second, or 2/50th, let's say. Because what happens is as you zoom, you magnify, and it magnifies everything, including your movement. I'm sure you've all had this experience before where, if you look through a telescope or something, that has a very high magnification, the slightest movement can create that shake. So the same goes with photography. And if you have a stabilizer, however, it gives you, in the case of the Tamron VC, about 4 additional stops. So that would mean if you were hand holding this image at, let's say, at 42 millimeters, so we'll say a 40th of a second, that you would be able to go to a 20th of a second, that would be one stop. Then a 10th of a second would be another stop. And then a 5th of a second would be another stop. And then beyond that would be about a half a second. So you should be able to hand hold between a half a second and a 1/6 of a second, with, presuming there's no major movement. So it can really help on those marginal low light situations. All right, the next thing I want to discuss has to do with understanding depth of field. Now, depth of field is controlled by several different factors. One of the things that it is controlled, the depth of field, has to do with the focal length of the lens you're using. So for example, a 24 millimeter lens has more depth of field than a 300 millimeter lens. So that's the first factor. The second factor has to do with the actual aperture you're using. Apertures that are wider apertures that let more light in have numbers like 3.5 or 2.0 or something like that. Those are larger, they let more light in, and the consequence of that is that there's less depth of field. So that's the second factor. And then the third factor has to do with the distance that you are physically focusing from your subject. So for example, if I'm using a 300 millimeter lens and I'm really close to my subject and I'm wide open at, whatever, f5.6 or something on my lens, that's going to give me a very narrow depth of field. The same lens at infinity, even wide open, would give you everything in focus. So the distance that you're physically focused is one thing, the actual f-stop you're using, and then the focal length. Those are the three factors. So we'll just give you some examples isolating some of those factors. So on the left-hand side, you can see how there's more blur in the background, right? Because you're using that lens 2.8 wide open. And here at 22, you have more depth of field. Now, sometimes having more depth of field, especially for a lot of landscape photography, is desirable. A lot of times for portraits, you want your subject to be sharp, but the background to be a little bit softer. And so most of the time people are shooting portraits, they're somewhere in this f8, f5.6, f11 aperture wise, because you want to be able to see the background, but you don't want it to be as sharp as the subject. This way the subject pops off of the background. So if you use even any program mode of your camera, if you could put it in portrait mode or landscape mode or whatever, what it's doing is it knows this information and it's trying to bias it towards, based on how much light there is, all of these factors. So in the case of landscape, give you more depth of field. In the case of portrait, give you a little bit less and isolate your subject. So we'll give you another example of that. Here's an image taken at f22 and then f2.8. So there's a pretty big difference in terms of the impact of this picture versus the impact of that picture. And if you're aware of this is how it works, then you would make these choices based upon the visual effect that you're trying to create. So those wider apertures blur out the background significantly more. Here's another example. This is taken with the 28 to 75 millimeter lens, wide open at 2.8 aperture, and at 75 millimeters, and at maybe almost the minimum focusing distance. So you can see that the depth of field is pretty small. Like the grass in the front is out of focus, then you get like the nose and the eye in focus, and then behind that, everything else out of focus. Now sometimes, if you put the focus in the right place, it can be desirable, because if everything's in focus, you as the viewer aren't really sure what the most important thing is. Here it's pretty clear that what exactly you should be looking at based upon what's physically in focus. Here's another example, also with that same lens, where when I took this image, I shot first the one with his face in focus, but then the foreground just looked a bit odd. And in fact, this picture was really more about that specific gesture. So that's where the focus was on the second one, and it's much more successful. Like clearly there's enough information for you to determine who that character is. If you needed to say, well, whether or not you know them, you can clearly make out all the features, so it's not faceless, but at the same time the focus being on that gesture in the foreground. Now, to do this from a really extreme angle, if you get super, super close and you're wide open, and especially if you're photographing children because they're smaller physically, then that means in order to fill the frame, you have to physically get closer, And the consequence of that is less depth of field. So here, this is with the 28 to 75 at 75 millimeters, 2.8 wide open, and extremely close to that subject. And so literally the entire face isn't in focus. It's just the eyes. Now the other reason is because the way that it works is it's all with respect to this particular plane, right? This is the plane of where your chip is. Now your minimum focusing distance is always measured from this little icon here, which is a circle with a line. And I'm pretty sure every single one of you has this on their camera, even if they never knew that it was there. So if you look for it now, you'll know that's exactly where your chip is. And when they measure the minimum focusing distance of your lens, it's always measured from that point. It's not the front of the lens. So with that said, if you get really physically close to someone this way, and we have a small depth of field, if I'm parallel to his face, then his eyes and his lips will all be in focus. As soon as I change the angle, well, now the angle's here. So that's what's happening in this photo. So her eyes are in focus, her chin's out. If I was parallel to her face, then that's the way that depth of field works. Very thin. Here's another example. This is using a macro lens, a true 1-to-1 macro lens. In this case, it's the 90 macro. I actually have this stopped all the way down to f16, so you would think that it's selectively depth. There's like not a lot of focus there, but once you get physically so close to something using a true macro lens, even to maintain a little bit of focus sometimes requires you to stop down. So that's at f16 using the true 1-to-1 macro. And then at the other extreme, this is 11 millimeters, and here, because we're already focused at infinity, that you have everything in focus. So again, using wider angle lenses gives you more depth of field. Getting really close to your subject gives you less depth of field. All right, this brings us to number 3, which is understanding the field of view. There are always these relationships in images between things, and everything that you choose to put in the frame is actually important information. So it may not be something that you cognitively, consciously consider when you're composing an image, but if you start to think about it or look at it later, you might say, well, it would have been better if I had this out or this. So when you're actually out there taking pictures and you're physically engaging with whatever you're photographing, be conscious of what's going in the frame, because that's the information that winds up ultimately getting conveyed. So, the image on the left-hand side, clearly there's enough information so you realize where that is, where an isolated part of it, maybe not so much, but you can't always tell. Like, for example, the sky there is a little bit washed out just because of the day. So sometimes you say, well, rather than try to get everything, I'll just isolate and get one specific thing. All right, here's an example. This was with the 70 to 200, 2.8 here in New York at Fashion Week a couple of years ago. This is at 200 millimeters and cropping out everything except for like the dresses and the arms in the final part of the runway show. Now it would have been possible, obviously, to use a different focal lens and then be able to see all of the models on the runway, but somehow by just isolating a specific part, sometimes it makes a little bit more impact in the image. Another example of something like that, where you're just taking a part of something and representing it for the whole. So you don't always have to show everything to get enough information to know what the photograph is of. And sometimes the idea of less being more is also a great way to be able to convey stories. So because of the mood, because of the fog, because of this, it just isolates one specific simple thing that normally gets crowded by all of these other things. So it makes it simple and a very clear sort of statement. So understanding that field of view also has some relationship to the lens that you use. So this, for example, is with the 10 to 24 millimeter at 10 millimeters. So, this is in Brooklyn at the Botanical Gardens, cherry blossoms and whatnot. So 10 millimeters, it starts to, it's the branches in this case are what sort of break up just this field of flowers, where if you focus on a specific one, then it becomes more about a specific blossom than the whole tree of blossoms. So you get a different mood and a different feel just depending on what you put into the frame. Another example here, for some people that were here earlier before, probably know what's coming. But here's the 270 millimeter end of the 18 to 270, isolating just part of the Brooklyn Bridge. If that's what you choose to take, that's fine, but then you wouldn't have thought that there would have been someone standing right in front of you at 18 millimeters. So one image, is taken from the exact same place, but think about all of the possibilities of, 270 millimeter pictures all in just that space. So whatever you choose to put in the frame really, really matters. Next, we're going to go to secret 4. And secret 4 is called understanding tension. And creating some sort of visual tension is a device that you can employ in your photography and sometimes can give it a little bit more impact. Now, sometimes it could be done wholly within one frame, like in this case, because of the placement of the reflections of the people, and because the way that the waves are sort of break them down, there's this inherent dynamic tension. If they were closer together in the center of the frame, it wouldn't have existed. But because they're closer to the edge of the frame, then that negative space is driving this, putting a wedge in between them, which is adding this concept of tension. Now, sometimes you can also do it by juxtaposing or putting pictures together. In this case, just out of curiosity, if I were to ask you what's happening here, you would say? Okay, yes. The older person is nagging the younger one. Also, top answers on the board, it's her mother-in-law. That seems to be a top answer on the board as well. Now, yeah, in reality, there's the picture on the left and the picture on the right were taken at two completely separate times, and they don't have any relationship to each other than the fact that I put them together. Now, one of the reasons I put them together was from a visual point of view, because the color relationships were similar. So I did this thing for a while where I would have, I basically have a stack of images that were of this tone and a stack this tone and I would just see, well, because the visually they start to work, then how do you start building narratives beyond that? And I found it an interesting experiment. But it's something to keep in mind that all the information, once we put this and that, immediately our minds are going to think that there's a reason that there should be related, and we make up these stories based upon the information that's in the image. So you can do it all these different types of ways. And the opposite of creating tension is to create resolution. So you can have something that's simple, beautiful, calm, that also has a certain power, and it's just all looking at it from a specific point of view. Secret number 5 is understanding composition. Now, there's two basic rules that I'm sure most of you in this room have at least heard of, and if not, then I'll be glad to introduce to you this concept of the rule of thirds. Now, the rule of thirds basically states if you take a frame and you draw 2 lines vertical and 2 lines horizontal, much like this diagram here, you wind up with 9 boxes and 4 points right in the center. And wherever these points cross, if you put something of information that's interesting or important in your image, in general, if it falls at one of those points, it's going to be a more interesting composition. So let's see if this holds water. All right. So here's the image. I, for one, like a lot of the negative space in it because I think it creates this feeling of suspension, which is, basically what we're doing. And if we draw that line right on top, you can see where that figure falls pretty much where one of those points cross. So if one of the challenges that maybe you're having is like your composition doesn't quite seem to be as strong as it could be, experiment with this idea of putting whatever your subject is in that particular point. And if you're the type of person that takes maybe, one picture of something, that's going to be the best picture of whatever it is that you have because it's the only one. If you were to just change one thing as an experiment or for yourselves, I would say change the composition. So rather than take one picture, try taking 3, and the thing that you change every time is that angle or that composition. And as you start to do that, it winds up being a valuable process, because inevitably, if I showed you 3 pictures of a subject, we're probably all collectively going to agree that one is better than the other 2. almost inevitably. And so we may not even know why, but if you go through that process to give yourself choices, it will definitely improve your photography. So here, another example of that. As you can see, especially when things become slightly more abstracted and there's no real point, like you can see how the flower that's pointing right towards us falls on one of those 4 points. But that also means that I can rotate this in any direction and it's going to fall on one of those 4 points. So realistically, I don't know if this one's better than that one, or maybe they're all pretty much the same, but if you work on that concept, then you're able to control that composition. So that's your basic rule of thirds. And then you have this idea which is called power quadrants. And in power quadrants, you, rather than break the frame into 9 boxes, you're breaking it into 4. And then if you concentrate something of interest in one of those, it can also create some strong composition. So something else to play with. Let's go number 6. Number 6 is understanding point of view. Now, when I say that, I don't necessarily mean like, what's your religious or political affiliation. It's more of the relationship physically that you are to your subject. Now, if you're close to your subject, if you're further back, if you photograph someone and you're close to them, then the image shows that you have that relationship. If you're shooting with a 500 millimeter lens of someone, then you're probably paparazzi or whatever. But so it's definitely a different type of photograph and a different relationship. And so whatever you're photographing, if you move around the subjects, try different positions, low angles, high angles, different lenses, and that really is pretty important. So here, for example, this is taken with an 18 millimeter lens from a really, really low angle, and these flowers are probably like, maybe this tall or whatever. But, once you put the lens really low and you exaggerate the perspective with a wide angle lens, well, then you start to create this dynamic and this relationship. So you can really start to play with this idea of scale with the relationship that you are to your subject. When photographing, especially children, it goes for people in general, but if you've ever seen the cover of, Newsweek or something like that, and, the title is like Nation in Crisis, then you're going to see someone usually shooting up at whoever this person is, so like these become interesting, the dynamics of the camera physically to the subject. If I want to make you look like a powerful, important executive, I'm going to shoot from a lower angle. If I just want to humanize you as much as possible, I'm going to be as straight. And so if you want if you're photographing children and you want to humanize them more, you get down to their level, because then you're shooting them this way. Otherwise, it's like your relationship to them shooting down, right? And so that angle really conveys a lot of information that we may not even be conscious of until we really start to analyze it and think about it. And then this is from a super really high point of view, and using a long lens. This was taken from the top of the Sears Tower of Lake Michigan, and all those little white things are moorings for boats, but it's winter, so there's no boats. But from a really high angle, and using this was in this case a 200 millimeter lens at infinity, and because I'm at a high angle, it compresses everything. So everything looks really flat. It almost looks like a painting. It doesn't have the same feel as a photograph. So all these different angles really impact how the pictures come out. All right, number 7, which is understanding the leading lines. Now, leading lines are something that we can use in our photographs to help guide the viewer's eyes through, or to put them to bring them to a point of something that's either interesting or important. And these can be any types of thing. The traditional leading line is like, I guess, just a road that's going in, but they can take on all different types of forms. In this case, it's literally a line. And so having that line go straight to the feet, then exactly, everything converges to that point. So there's not really any question about what the subject is and where to go, because the line is literally taking you there. Here's another example. because when I look at this image, the first thing I see is the girl's face, and then I follow her arm down, follow the rope to the horse, and then I go back up to her. And so it's creating a pattern, and there's a circle in there. So despite the fact these are all still images, you're creating rhythm and you're creating movement throughout for your eye to follow. And then here's the classic leading line. There's your little road taking you into Kincaidville or whatever that might be. I wanted to just speak for a moment, because this had come up by some people, and talk about lens hoods. Now, all Tamron lenses, if you purchase this lens, it comes with the lens hood. And the lens hood is designed to be able to give you the most amount of protection from flare, because flare can ruin the contrast of your image and the quality. And so basically the way it works is, I'm going to remove this lid here. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it from where you're at right now, but if you see that light hitting this lens, anytime you have that situation, that's the potential for flare. So having one of these hoods, if I take this off entirely, now you're all going to see that there's going to be flare because those lights are right there. But if I put this back on, and it's not directly pointing towards the light source, now it should shield it from flare. So it's going to improve the image quality. Now, why are they this flower-shaped hood? The reason is it gives you the maximum amount of protection without vignetting. So for example, if you inscribed right in here a rectangle, it would be the exact same dimensions as your chip, so of the chip of your camera. So because lenses put out an image circle and the chip is this size, it gives you the maximum amount of protection without vignetting. So vignetting obviously is if I put the lens hood on incorrectly like this, now this is actually blocking some of the area, and so I would see a dark part of the corner. So all the Tamron lenses come with them, and it's specifically designed for, each lens. Other manufacturers, I think many of the Nikons, I believe, come with them. I think the Canons are an option, and I think the Sonys come with them as well. So it sort of depends, but they're all available, and it's recommended by most manufacturers to have them for that specific reason. All right, we're going to go on to, I think, the 8th secret. You all feeling the 8th secret about now? All right. And that is very important. It's called look for and understand light. Now, light, obviously, is an extremely important part of photography. But there's one thing to be able to get something well exposed. There's another thing to be able to either control light or the relationship that you have to your subject, which creates the mood. So for example, here's an image that was taken at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and you can see the light is coming from the side because you see a highlight side on the boy's face, and then you see a shadow side, and the same thing with the mother. So you know that the light is coming in at an angle. Now, a lot of times when you have light that comes in at an angle, it creates depth and dimension, and that is what we're looking to create. If you wind up photographing everything with your flash, and it's this flash on camera here, let's say, and this little flash here is going to make really flat light because it's coming from directly the same angle as your lens, and so everything's going to be flat. Now, if you were able to take this flash off, or if you took another light off, then you're going to create dimension. So even if we look at these lights here on me, this is coming from the front, but it's a little higher than the flash, so you're getting some dimension. And then as I turn, now the light, these people over here will see a lot more modeling of the light because it's coming in from the side. So the angle of the light to the subject becomes very important on how we perceive things. So for example, this was taken at 8 a.m., about 9 a.m. of this subject. And in this case, I'm letting the light illuminate them. Well, what I did is I walked up the pier, and 2 minutes after I took that picture, I took this one. Now, what does this say? Well, the light's the same, subject's the same, photographer's the same, but the angle of the light to the subject and the angle of the photographer to the subject change. So anytime you change one of those three things, either the light or the subject or the angle that you are to the subject, then everything changes. So here, this has a completely different tone, mood, feel, even though it's the same subject and the lighting is the same. So I would urge all of you, if you haven't done this, when you start photographing whoever or whatever, is take a walk around whatever your subject is, and you'll start to notice that, oh, well, wait, from here the light looks much better. Because when I started in photography, I could see expression, I could see moods, but I wasn't able to really successfully see light. And I wouldn't know. I could say, well, yeah, this looks pretty good, but then I would take a picture, like it doesn't look as good as it looks to me with my naked eye. And then you start to realize that, oh, it's because of the lighting. And so, if you can move your subject, use walls to bounce, there's all these ways to modify light in the real world. I'll give you another example. Here's an image I took of this boy. This was with the 28 to 75 millimeter lens at 2.8. I was happy with the composition, more or less. It's kind of the picture I wanted to take. The only problem actually is the lighting. And it's not that it's not well exposed, it's just that essentially he's being backlit. And the result of that is that we have, like, you see the lightness, and then you see darkness, and then you see lightness. Well, I knew that the light wasn't good, so I asked this boy if he would turn around 180 degrees, and then I took this picture. Now, several things happened here. One is that now it goes light, dark, light, so the pattern is more interesting. And perhaps even more importantly, you can see the catch light in his eye, right? And our eyes look for points where there's extreme contrast. And so where's the most extreme contrast in this entire image is right in his eye. So what's that going to do? That's going to make us, the viewer, connect much more with this child than with that child, even though clearly it's the same child. So, having that point there, and this is just by turning him around, 180 degrees. Nothing, again, same photographer, lens, place, all of this stuff. So look for and understanding light turns out to be an extremely important thing, that as you go out and about in the world and start to become conscious of these things and how it works, I can guarantee that your photography will improve. Now, sometimes you can also manipulate the light in different ways. In this case, you've probably seen those big shiny pop-up reflectors, right? Probably. If not, they have them here at B&H. I would recommend it if you photograph people. They're very handy. And they can add light. So in this case, you can see light on the edge of their hair, right? That's from the sun. So the sun is behind them. And then what I did is I have one of those shiny things, and you can see the catch light in their eyes, right? And that's from the reflection of the light bouncing back to them. So I was able to manipulate the light, and now it's almost like having two lights. One is creating that nice hair light, which is a separation, and then the second one is returning light to them. Because realistically, if I could have tried to just expose without that reflector, and I probably could have got an okay exposure, but then the quality of light would be different. And so no flash on that. All right, here's another example. The light is coming from behind her, but in this case, it's bouncing into a huge white wall. So to give you the scenario, if this was the white wall right here, then my subject would be right here, and then my back would be to that white wall. So you can find this outside on a sunny day. It's like in the middle of the day. Oh, terrible time to photograph, but maybe not. Maybe you can find places where the lighting looks great, and it's always there if you know what you're looking for. So taking advantage of large reflected light sources that just exist right all out and about. Here's another example. I was kind of happy with this. I like the drama to this picture here. However, his mother would prefer to see him. So in this case, I added some flash to that. And so you can see what we're looking at here is in this second picture, there's actually two light sources, because the sun, which was making this really dramatic rim light, still exists in the second picture. So that, if I had just had the on-camera flash without that sun, it would still be kind of flat. But because of that, now he has a lot more dimension to his face. But in this case, using two lights, one taking advantage of the sun, and the second, my on-camera flash. Secret number 9 is also sort of important, and I would urge you all to try this if you haven't before. Maybe you don't have to, actually. Maybe I can save you the trouble. But to understand how your camera works and how the latitude of exposure works, because I'm sure you've all experienced taking a picture and you're like, that's not the way that I see it. Well, partially it's because the camera doesn't see the way that we see. It has the ability to see maybe 10, 12 something stops of light, which is based on an amount. It's a halving or a doubling. And our eyes could see maybe 30. So that means we can be in this room and I can be looking out on all of you, and despite the fact I have a very bright light in my face, I can kind of make out most of you, because of that case. If you ask the camera to do that, that would be too bright or you would be too dark, because the contrast, the latitude that you're asking it to capture is beyond what it captures. So what I did here was a little test that basically goes through over and underexposing the same exact scene to see exactly what it is that the camera sees. So for example, right now that says f8 at a 500th of a second. This happened to be shot at 100 ISO, if anyone really cares, but f8 at a 500th of a second. So f8 is the aperture, 500th a second of the shutter speed. And next to that is a little 0. And there's a 0 there because that, according to the camera's meter, was the correct exposure. So I want to take a picture of this. The camera says, if you said it that way, that's what's right. Okay, that's what the camera says. So then what I decided to do is I underexposed it by 1 stop. Now, when I underexpose it by 1 stop, you'll notice in this case, it went from a 500th of a second to a 1,000th. So by making the shutter speed twice as quick, I've added half as much light, and the result is 1 stop darker. And so that's what we get. And then I did it one more time. So if I was going to do it one more time, what would the shutter speed be? 2,000th. Very good. You shoot it in manual? I shot it in manual. And then I did it one more time. Let's say, what happens if we went 4,000th? And then just to go totally crazy, an 8,000. So that's underexposed by 4 stops from what the meter says. But what we'll notice is that in the scene, the sun, being the sun, is still overexposed, right? However, everything else got dark, I think by about maybe 3 stops or so. This part actually is kind of looking nice if that's what we were only looking at that particular part. You can see how the saturation increases as things get underexposed. So if you've experienced photographing sunsets before and they looked washed out, well, this tells us that if we underexpose from what the camera says, then we're going to get more saturation and color. So something good to know. And then what I did was the opposite. So we started originally at f8 at a 500th of a second. So if I wanted to overexpose 1 stop by manipulating the shutter speed, I would go to 2/50th of a second. And so that was 1 stop overexposed from what the camera said was correct. Then I went 2 stops overexposed, 3, and finally 4 from what the camera said. Now what we'll notice at 4 stops overexposed from the camera's meter of the whole scene, well, this looks about right, right? So the camera is looking at all these tones and it's making an average based upon the light. But if this is the way we want our picture to look, our camera would know that. It just knows what it sees. So this, at least, then you can understand that throughout this, there's all of these different tones, and exposing for the part of the picture that's most important to you is what's important. So here's an example where the camera's meter would do an absolutely terrible job. Because there's so much brightness in the scene, it wants to make it darker because it doesn't know that there's this white that we want white. It just is trying to make everything this average tone, which in this case is not what we want. So that means if you have a lot of light or white in your image and you want it to look the way that you perceive it, then what you need to do is overexpose from what the camera's meter says it thinks is correct. So in this case, if I were to meter this scene and and I took the photograph, it would be too dark. So I have to overexpose it because there's a lot of light in the scene. And then it looks the way that I want it. Then you also have the opposite, which is if you have a lot of darkness in the scene, the camera wants to make it brighter. And so by doing that, it would wash out all of that red color. So in this case, we have to underexpose it. So if there's a lot of dark things in your image, usually you have to underexpose it. A lot of bright things in your image, you overexpose it. And then you'll get the exposure for the part of the image that you're trying to get correctly. A little story about this particular image. I think for me, I don't mind spending time in Lightroom or Photoshop or these type of things, but the part that I like the most is usually taking the images. That's just me. Everyone can approach it differently. There's no right or wrong way. I mean, I'm assuming most of you do this because you like doing it, so whatever part that you like doing, that's the part you should spend most of your time doing. So in this case, I prefer to get it as best I can in the camera. Now, it's not to say that all of these images you've seen have probably been manipulated or tweaked in some little way. And there wasn't anything major. I didn't composite anything on any of these photographs, but there was some sort of something done to them from the original image to what you just saw, whether it was changing the contrast or maybe changing the levels or whatever, pulling out some detail from the shadows that you wouldn't have seen in the original image, things like this. And so in this case, I came across this, this was in Kyoto, and I came across this scene the night before this image was taken, and smart people travel with tripods. Just remember that. I, however, did not have a tripod. So I wanted to take this image, and there was no way I could take it because the sun had already gone down like way too far. And so the only way that I would have been able to take it the night before, by the time I got there, would have been take like 2 images, and one exposed properly for the sky and the other exposed properly for the lanterns. The problem is, without a tripod, trying to take multiple images from the same position is pretty impossible. As it was, I precariously balanced my camera on my bag at a cockeyed angle with using the self-timer, and I mean, it worked, clearly. Not the best way to do it, but sometimes you invent solutions to problems that you have on the fly. So in this case, I came back the following night earlier. So the sun had gone down, but there's still some glow. So you can see from behind how the clouds are slightly illuminated, and there's some blueness to the sky. If you got there much later, then obviously that light goes away. So, so it looks like night, but there's detail there as opposed to it being that black. So in this case, doing it right in the camera meant going back the next day. You can also play with certain things. In this case, you can see the blur in the background, right? And there's, she's relatively sharp compared to the background. And in this case, if you're willing to get on a tire swing with your camera and have somebody spin you on it, then you're very easily able to take this picture. Because when you think about it, like me relative to this girl, we're not really moving, right? Because we're on a tire spinning together. So relative to each other, we're not really moving, but relative to the rest of the world, we are. So right at about a 30th of a second or a 60th of a second, we're able to get, blur the background and keep the foreground sharp. Now, it depends how fast you're going, which is the appropriate shutter speed to get this effect. But if you have someone spinning you at a good speed, you can create blur and have sharpness at the same time, just by that. And that also reminds me of the technique of panning. Is anyone familiar with the technique of panning? All right. In the technique of panning, you take your camera and you're following a moving subject, and you're usually tracking it and photographing as you do that. And what that does, again, it reduces the relative speed of whomever or whatever you're photographing to the camera. And so you're able to get clearer pictures by doing that. And sometimes you're also able to blur the background and have the subject sharp at the same time. So it shows this idea of movement much more effectively sometimes than freezing all the action. Because if you photograph a race car on a track at an 8,000th of a second, you're going to stop everything, and that car is there, but it just looks like it's kind of parked there. If you see some sort of blur or movement, then the implication is that it's moving. And so you're able to use those things to be able to make images a little bit better. All right, we're up to number 11. It's the U factor, yes. You have to experiment. You have to try things that you wouldn't normally try. And I find a lot of times by making assignments up for yourself, however simple they might be, at least gives you some direction and it gives you something to focus on. Because the more that you have options, the less likely you are to have focus. So I can put it this way. When I started out in photography, I taught myself a couple of different techniques that just sort of came out of the process of doing it all the time. And one of them was I would go through, and at the time it was film, and I would shoot a roll of film, and then I'd go into the darkroom and develop it, and then make a contact sheet and go through all this process. And inevitably there'd be a frame in there that I liked, that I either didn't remember taking, or I didn't think was going to be good, and it wound up being better than the one that I thought was going to be good. Because photography is a process. And you know, when you were dealing with photography and film, it made it even more of a process. And now everything is so much quicker, but it doesn't mean it's still not a process, it just happens quicker. So I think being cognizant of that, and then you go back and you look at your own images, you know, even I almost never delete an image right in the camera, because I could look at it a week later and have a completely different opinion than the moment that I look at it. Because the moment I look at it, if it's not exactly what I had here and I can't instantaneously translate it, I might think it's terrible. But in reality, with a little bit of perspective, you'll understand your own work and your own vision better by reviewing things at different particular points. And I think that to me is always a very valuable way of understanding your own work. Anyway, with that said, so I would find an image and I'm like, I guess I was just, it was like lucky, I guess I got that, you know. So, and I would go back and then but it would consistently happen. So like when I noticed the consistency of the luck, even though I seem to never remember taking these images, I realized there must be something to the whole approach, because at the end of the day, if I'm always getting a picture that I was happy with on a roll of film that I'm like, oh, this is great, whatever I was doing was working. So you just sort of keep doing it. So when you find an image that you take that works, or maybe you didn't think that works, and then someone else will say, hey, I like that. And you say, well, it's not what I wanted. And maybe it's not, but maybe you have a relationship to that, and that can help guide your path to your own photography as well. All right, so here's a couple of images. These were all taken on the same day, and with a friend of mine who's a musician. We were putting together a package for her album a couple years ago. All taken with different lenses, different lighting, different time of day, but it was just through the course of one day. So this with the 18, it was 18 millimeters in the car. We drove around probably for half an hour. I probably took 74 or 75 pictures. Most of them were terrible, but that's okay. And I think that you also should realize that taking risks and making mistakes or not getting exactly what you want is also probably a good thing. So, you know, some people can walk into a scene, take one picture and be like, it's perfect, and walk away. But most people, that's not the case. And, you know, even with people that are some of the best in the world at whatever their type of photography, take, you know, hundreds, sometimes thousands of pictures to get that one picture that they're after. So there is something to be said for the math of it as well. You know, you take one picture, it's the best one you have. You take 300, well, now you have to go through 300 pictures, right? That's terrible. But at least you have options, right? So again, whatever, if you're the type of person that takes one picture, try taking 3. If you're the type of person that takes 800, I don't know, maybe try 3 or something. You know, whatever you do to give yourself a new challenge, because that winds up giving you some focus. So this was taken, you know, same subject, a different place later in the day. The sun had just gone down. Again, I'm not using the camera's meter because it wants that background to be dark, but I don't. I want it to be light and to fade off. And then I added flash in the front. And this was, again, this is the light had just set. And if the light just set, then what's the light on her? Well, that's an off-camera flash, which I literally put on the ground. It's like a little speed light just on the ground with a remote facing up. So, you know, I'm able to, because now it gives a little detail there. There's dimension, there's playing with lighting, not even a diffuser, just straight on. And so play with all of these different things. And sometimes, whether or not it's just saying, well, today I'm going to photograph this object, this person, this subject, whether or not you walk around the city or have some other location, that gives you some focus. And then this was at the end of the day, using a couple of different strobe lights inside. One is bouncing off of the ground. Another thing, a technique that I came across at some point, is sometimes you see great light in a room, but the quality of it is fantastic, the amount's not enough. Well, you can take your flash and put it like right where the, what underneath that lamp, right under the shade, and then get that same quality of light, but just much brighter with a flash. So, if you see light that you like, you can just make it even better. Sometimes. All right, here's another approach to certain things. Again, this was a subject. I was at the beach and just spent the week collecting random shells. And as I did, I would just photograph them all with the macro lens and all at 1:1. So that means that if this is shot at 1:1 with a macro lens, that shell is like super, super small. And so I collected a whole bunch of them, and then at the end of the week, put it all together. So I gave myself a little assignment, something to do, something interesting, something to explore, and different ways of seeing. And so that's one of the things that I think if you do for yourself, no matter what your interest is, you'll find that you will refine your craft pretty significantly. All right, let's see. www.Tamron. It's actually Tamron-USA.com now. They recently changed that, and I haven't updated this yet. Tamron-USA.com is the Tamron website, and there they have videos, articles, all sorts of great information about photography, in addition, obviously, to information about lenses. But because you've attended this and you get the idea, you know everything about the lenses, so maybe you want to learn more about the photography. But it's a really great site. They have on there the Tamron Learning Center, and it's contributing articles from various techs and professional photographers about all different types of photography, and it's a really good resource in addition to Tamron's blog, which is called Angle of View. So they have lots of updated articles, how-tos, and all types of things on different types of photography as well. So if there are no more questions, then I guess we can consider the session adjourned. But I will be around if you do have any other questions you'd like to ask. Thank you very much.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.